Now actually you'll come across this story greatly embroidered in H.P.B's book Hills and Jungles of Hindustan, and you'll find it embroidered out of all recognition. This is the true story, but the one in Caves and Jungles, there's but little relation to the actual facts. But the Colonel says the thing is that she wrote these stories for the Caves and Jungles of Hindustan for publication in Russia. And several of the stories she tells there, he said, highly embroidered. But they brought her in a little money, and she had to have some money to live on. And it's quite fun if you've ever read this book, only don't take it as fact, because a lot of it is not. These stories, like the one of the ducks, and spices that H.P.B. put into her charming Indian wonder book to make it interesting to the Russian public, in whose language it was originally written. We've got a couple of copies in the library actually, and they're quite fascinating, if only you knew which bits were true and which were embroidery, of course. Her mother, of course, was a famous authoress in Russia, and she is always described as having been the Russian George Sand, which means that she wrote works of classic proportions. Well then, we come up to Good Friday, and again his usual term, on orders HPB and HSO, set out for Rajputana. They met at Allahabad. Babu, who, I'm not sure whether it's Sir Das, you may be able to help me with this, a follower of the Sikh Guru Nanak, who had since 1827, that is for 52 years, sat in the open, heat, rains, cold, whatever, meditating. He had sat there undisturbed through the whole of the mutiny, which is almost unbelievable, but it's recorded as fact, and they actually met him. He sits all day and at midnight bathes and prays at the junction of the Ganges and the Jumna. He was blind but very cheerful. And another sannyasi whom they met at the same time, offered to produce food for him by the loaves and fishes method. But he refused, he refused because he said, anybody can do that. It's of no value and no importance, whatever. And HSO, Colonel Olcott himself, considers them illusions. And if they are not, he wants to know whether those who partake of such loaves and fishes are nourished by them. The idea is, apparently, that a grain of rice or a fish or a fruit is a nucleus around which an adept can collect the matter of space. But he doesn't say any more about it. And then they went on to Jaipur. Now, Jaipur is a very wonderful and beautiful city. Of what I would have thought was a sort of pale rose red, but it's absolutely a beautiful place to see. But the Colonel said it was like Paris done in raspberry cream, and he wasn't really very impressed by it. It was known then as the Pink City. I'm sorry, it was H.P.B. who said it was like Paris done in raspberry cream, because the Colonel had not been to Paris then. And there was a very pleasant little tale that he told they went somewhere on elephant back. HPB was not very pleased or very happy riding on an elephant, but in fact they did so. And one of the members of the party began to fall off the elephant, sliding helplessly backwards over his tail. And the elephant, and they are marvellous creatures, I know this, sort of wrapped his little tail round the chap's ankle and held him on until he got his seat again. They are. It is so awful to think of elephants in circuses and so forth, because they are animals of enormous intelligence, and I think in their way very high level beings. But it's the Colonel was in fits of laughter at this, but it was a remarkable little story. Still, they had the Russian spies thing around them. They saw outside the city a yogi in Samadhi who'd been entombed for 7 days, and another whose forehead glows with spiritual light when in contemplation. And HPB simply said, "Oh, that's Tejasa." Well, it's all very well, but there are not many people who can sort of do this thing. They then went to Agra and saw the Taj Mahal, which, of course, he records is said to be the materialized replica of a temple in Muhammad's palace, which may or may not be true. But the tale was that it was seen in a vision as a plan by a fakir who gave it to Shah Jahan. And then they went on to a place called Saharanpur. Now, the only reason I mention Saharanpur is that this was the place where I was stationed during the war, where there was somebody whose grandmother had been to a lecture by HPB in Saharanpur. Now, I doubt this, because there's no record of HPB ever lecturing as such. It was the Colonel who did the lecturing. She would give informal talks and she would teach, but lecture was not her thing at all. But nevertheless, there was indeed a society in those days at Saharanpur. It's a big railway junction, and it's only 14 miles, about 14 miles from Hardwar, which is one of the places of pilgrimage. And one of our problems every year while I was there was the great Mela, a festival that they used to have there, where 3 million people used to converge on a place about the size of Taffel. And of course the problem was that there was always outbreaks of cholera and disease, and no sanitation, and such enormous problems of dealing with so many people. Actually, the first year I was there, several people were drowned because they were pushed into the river by the sheer weight of numbers. But the military police sorted this out by, cleverly I thought, putting 3 gates and having a caparisoned elephant to lead the procession, and bands and things. And they went into one gate, which was closed behind them, and then, it was done quite intelligently like that. And at least they didn't lose any more people. So the town was crowded with pilgrims from Hardwar, and a very enthusiastic branch was formed, but unfortunately, apparently, even before they'd left, the eclecticism of Theosophy in Saharanpur changed to a sort of sectarian exclusiveness, And having done their work, they moved off to the other near big town, Meerut, where the colonel lectured. And then they went with their police spy, and then they left for Bombay, and the police spy was still with them, and he was getting very jaded, and he wanted to go home, but he couldn't because these people kept on moving about. HSO was writing weekly letters regarding his adventures to the New York paper. Now, 1887, one of the interesting things that they saw in Darjeeling was a collection of manuscripts from Tibet, and they met a Lama ascetic who the colonel says levitated, and it impressed the colonel very much. But the Lama said, anybody in my monastery can do it, and it's didn't think it was of any interest at all. On the 1st of August, the colonel lectured at Siliguri, which is another railway junction, on the station platform. And he lectured on theosophy and religion to a good audience. It's another station called Kulai. I don't quite know where that is. Would you know by any chance? No. It's northeast India, I think. The clerk on the platform of the railway station read their labels on their luggage. And they went to stay in the dark bungalow. A dark bungalow is a sort of a... they are set all through India. Dark really actually means mail, the post. And the post was taken from bungalow to bungalow, and you could stay there if you were travelling. And the dark bungalow was invaded by Bengalis to talk philosophy at 1 o'clock in the morning. And the colonel, as always, obliged. And they went down from there to Barisal, down the Ganges, where 1,000 people were waiting for him to lecture to them. But he hadn't been given any warning. They just appeared and said, would you like to talk to us about this? So this went very well. And by the time the first 1,000 had moved off, another group had come, so I had to give a second lecture. And then the boat didn't arrive to take them further down the Ganges, so he formed the TS branch. It really is very, very amusing, By the way, I found my copy, the large copies of the Colonel Olcott's diary were not cut. So nobody's read them before, and I don't know what all my forebears were doing, but there it was. But I love that, yes. The boat didn't come, so he formed the TS branch. Wait a minute. At last the steamer came, and they boarded it, and it went down the Ganges a little way, and it ran into a sandbank, and they got stuck. So he gave two lectures in one meeting. The spiritual life, the first, and karma, the second. Each lasting 2.5 hours. Now, that's a big difference, isn't it? And at 5 p.m. to a similar number on body, mind and soul. All the time forming branches. And at Noakali, which must be lower down, I've not heard of this ever, HSO was highly embarrassed by a prelude in my honour. So then they made their way back to Bombay, and they founded the Theosophists, which of course is still going today, our standard magazine. And I think there I'll stop, because that's a good place, I can remember that we got as far as founding the Theosophist, because there's only another 2,700 pages to come. You might like to know that the Colonel was chased by a gigantic flamingo in Japan.
Well, somebody's getting a question ready. Did you mention that Colonel Alcott, where was Mrs. Alcott?
There was a Mrs. Alcott, yeah.
About
which we know nothing.
Very much.
I believe he also had two sons as well.
But you mentioned that she was perceptive, rather.
No, this was Mrs. Sinnott.
Sorry.
Patience Sinnott.
How did Colonel Alcott communicate with these people that must have had different languages? Was he able to speak the languages, or were they able to?
No, he wasn't actually. I think the scholars in India, because so far we've only been in India, the scholars in India mostly spoke English in those days. It was the lingua franca, you see, the only one that everybody spoke because of the British Empire. I don't think the Colonel ever learnt Hindustani or anything. Although when he went to Japan, he was of course a Buddhist. We haven't got to that bit yet, and he recited the Buddhist prayers in Pali, which was one of the classic languages, you know. But it isn't mentioned, and I don't think actually that he didn't speak Hindi for one thing. But of course his lectures were sort of for students and the educated people. But it doesn't add up with the things he did later, because when he had his healing sessions as a sort of magnetic healer, he healed anybody that came, and I should think that he was able to have a word with them. But of course they lived in India for quite a few years, but it isn't mentioned actually.
Just wondered.
Yeah.
Communication is so difficult if you don't know the language.
Well, it is true, but you must remember that the British Empire had been there for quite a long time, for 50 years by that time, and it was the general language. I mean, most India, there were, if I remember rightly, about 104 different languages in India in the early days, and they couldn't speak to one another, really.
Do we know, Charles, who financed the inauguration of the society, and later on the travelling expenses of?
Yeah, they weren't financed. They paid their own.
Huh?
They weren't financed. They paid their own, and it started on a sort of shoestring. They made a little money, not for themselves, but for the society, out of the Theosophist. When they started, they very soon got quite a big circulation for the magazine, which not only paid for itself, but many times they were desperate for money, really desperate for money, almost not enough to eat, Yes.
Can you say anything, Charles, about his work in Ceylon?
I haven't got to that bit.
Was that after, as a sort of second?
It's after this, yes.
Oh, I see.
Actually, the story they go back to Bombay, and then from Bombay they set out for Ceylon, which is quite a story in itself, because that's where they became Buddhists, And the Colonel sort of lectures to 2,000 in the afternoon and 3,000 in the evening. It's unbelievable, but to have such figures. The point seemed to be, you see, that they were always so fascinated by somebody who would come and talk to them about their own religion without any bias towards this school, or that shade, or that shade. And that was how he came to be the man who wrote the Buddhist Catechism. And 10 years ago, that was in its 73rd edition. It's only a little thing, but it was the Colonel's Catechism, which was the only one that Ceylon, Japan, and all the schools of Buddhism would accept. They wouldn't accept if one of them did it. It's quite a simple little book, but it's amazing. And of course, it was due to this that they have this magnificent statue of him, which Liz has seen. Yes, yeah. It's a beautiful statue, apparently. And you know that the Buddhist flag was not designed by a Buddhist, but by the Colonel. Yeah.
It's an interesting point. It only just occurred to me during your talk this evening, and from what I've read before, that it's probably the TS got more to Alcott than to HPB, because of the tremendous pioneering work he did.
He was the organizer. She was the sage.
Man, wasn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, he was the sort of anchor man, we'd say these days. She was the sage, you see, the mage, the shaman, or I hear it's pronounced shaman these days, but it should be shaman, I think. However, that was what she was, and she was the one through whom came the books and the contact with the masters to begin with. But he was the organisation chap, tireless, and really had almost a genius for organisation. When you come to consider, as you will hear later on, that sometimes these 5 lectures in a day, and on one occasion, well, more than one occasion, he arrives at some little railway junction in India, and there they are waiting for him on the platform, and they say, will you talk about the higher aspects of the relationship between Atman and, if you like, the cosmos. No notice whatever. And he'd do it too. Plus this capacity of his for healing. And the thing that interests me is that the healing didn't always work. He records in volume 3 or something, 3 or 4, the one man came back 6 times before his healing was final. He was blinded, and there were several other people who came to him whom he couldn't heal at all, and he said their magnetism was opposed rather than in sequence, and it did tire him out, I know. And of course life was really quite rough, really, because an Indian bullock cart as a means of travel, no springs or anything, and very long journeys, and then lectures and time or day after day in the heat. I don't know how he survived in the summer, because he seemed always to dress like this, and the beard alone would have been a bit warm, wouldn't it? No, he wasn't.
How old was he when he died?
Dear, I can't remember.
60.
I think it was only about 60. HPB was 60.
80?
No, he wasn't anything like as old as that.
I thought that was
No.
In his 60s.
In his 60s, yes. Yes.
Friday night.
No, I don't think so. I've never seen a picture of him without it. He certainly had it. And a strange little bit of history. Colonel Alcott saw John Brown going on his way to be executed down in the southern states. And how he got there, they'd have lynched him if they'd known he was a northern officer down in the Confederate States. And how he got there was he was passed on from one Masonic lodge officer to another. He was then reporting for the New York Sun or something, one of those papers. And he was passed on from one Masonic lodge to another because the Southerners would have lynched him. And he said he records that it's recorded in his biography, Hammer on the Mountain, that John Brown was on this cart being taken to his execution, and he turned round and looked very fixedly at the colonel as he passed. It's a sad story. It's a stupid story, really, because John Brown, you see, led an abortive and stupid attack on Fort Sumner and was captured. It was really a sort of commando attack without John Brown being a commando. I mean, you know, you've got to have talent for this and training and backup, and he didn't have anything, so they simply captured him, and of course he was condemned to death. But it's a curious thing when, you know, the colonel was there when he went on his raid.
What age, well, I would think HPP would be aware that the sadhu overtook her.
Well, it's the only thing the only way you can describe it is that she left her body and went elsewhere.
But would she know that she...
Oh, I should think so, yes. Oh, I should think so. Oh, it was done voluntarily.
Yes.
Voluntarily, yeah. Yeah. Yes, Frank.
Are there any accounts of how his hour-long lectures were received, Charles? I mean,
Oh, yes.
But I was thinking about the captain on that ship that ran onto the sandbank. Telling it's true, don't you run on that sandbank again, you'll get another hour of lecture.
I get the impression that actually somehow they got ashore, that you know, the Ganges is not always deep, it's quite shallow sometimes, which was how it happened. And it's possible that the lecture was actually done on the banks. But then, if you were going to ask the same question about the railway platform, you see, they were hungry for this knowledge that he had. I suppose you could say that they had it before, but some of it was lost, and you know, it was being brought back for them, and so they'd sit anywhere and crowd anywhere. And in any case, in any little Indian town, there would be the Maidan, a sort of open plain like there was in the one that I lived in, where you could have several thousand, you see. I mean, I suppose Sai Baba really has a sort of Maidan where the great numbers come for him to talk to. But it is a point, but he doesn't mention it in the only that it took place. But the big ones, I think, they're not organised. That's what amazes me. And when they do organise them, as they did in Ceylon, the place is hopelessly overcrowded, and they're sort of climbing trees outside and listening through the windows, you know. It's remarkable story.
I know at the end of his career, of his healing career, he was warned to give it up because
yes,
it
was taking too much out.
Sapping his strength.
Yeah.
How did he come into it? How did he find out he could heal?
Well, not exactly by accident. He just set about doing it.
Did he?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I see.
And you must accept that these are two very remarkable and very unusual human beings. It says somewhere in the letters, I think, Ray, can you remember, we searched for 100 years before we got these together. Is it in the letters?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. We searched for 100 years. And that means that there are probably vast numbers of possibles who were looked at, you know.
Would you count Judge as one of the founders?
He was, well, no, he wasn't one of the founders. There were only two founders, but Judge carried on the TS in America pretty well single-handed. And there's quite a touching story about Judge, because if you remember, I said that by 79 there was only sort of one lodge left. It sort of almost foundered. And I read in America, I read that Judge used to have no audiences whatever. He'd arrange a lecture, and he'd go and open the proceedings as though he had an audience, and then sit and sort of meditate, you know. But the lodge would be open, and then very slowly the odd person used to come. And if one came, he gave the lecture as though there were 50,000, you know. He was very dedicated. And something went wrong at a later date, of which I've never really been quite certain what it was. But he seemed to go sideways, and yet the Americans have always bitterly fought for him, and he really was a remarkable chap. And I think it may well be one of those things that happens to anybody who tries to push on a forlorn cause, you know. And we owe these two such a debt. You never make it up, really. But to stand amazed at the amount of work they did. And they never helped themselves. There's one reference about 2 o'clock on a very hot evening in a New York summer, and I believe that's pretty awful. The Colonel said, I wish we had some grapes, I think, and HPB put out her hand, and there was a large bunch of black grapes, and that's the only time that I ever remember them doing anything like that for themselves.
Well, thank you for that, Charles. That's a nice story to end on.
Yeah, it is really.
On behalf of the meeting, thank you very much for a very entertaining and informative talk.